CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS Talks.
Talk to me.
CLS
Talk to
Talks.
me.
Real information.
Talk to me.
Real education.
Talk to me. Talk to me. They don't talk to me. They look like that morning. They don't talk to me. That morning. They don't talk to me. That morning. They don't talk to me. That morning.
You're welcome back to the CLS Talks. It's been a while, and the reason it's been a while is because we have got a storming series of shows ready for your oral delectation. I'm Lionel Coveney, and I'm joined, as always, by Des Carty. Des, how are things?
I'm grand, Lionel. Are you sure you're Lionel Coveney now?
Alive and Coveney.
Alive and Coveney.
We've a very interesting series, as I said, and we're going to be looking with some specificity at the Gary Doyle Order.
Specificity?
It's a new word I learned over Christmas. And it's something that we have touched on quite a number of times on this show over the months, but we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty of what a Gary Doyle Order is about, because it's one of the most powerful tools that anybody can use in their defensive armoury if they're attacked by the state or they're attacked by somebody in court or whatever it might be, or the guards, exactly. So
to be specific.
That is to be specific. So continuing with that same level of specificity, what is the Gary Doyle Order, Des?
Well, there you go now. That's a very, very good question, and I'm glad you asked. As they're saying out there on the doorsteps. The Gary Doyle Order it's a reference to a case that was heard in the Supreme Court. Now, I couldn't, for the life of me, quote the year, but they'll find the details.
1994, I think.
Now, that's very good. That's very specific.
I stand open to correction, but that's off the top of my head.
Okay, so it was an order given specifically to a defendant called Gary Doyle, wherein the court directed that the DPP should disclose all of the evidence to him as the defendant, or the accused, if you like. So that meant that they set a precedence. Prior to that, it was down to, if you like, the discretion of the guards of the DPP, so on and so forth, the prosecutor. It was down to their discretion to disclose all the evidence to the defendant or the accused. So the High Court ruling adjudged in, as you suggested, 1994, that Gary Doyle should have all the evidence, be it stuff that the prosecutor deemed not appropriate or appropriate. All of the evidence meant all of the evidence.
Okay, so there's no ambiguity there.
Yes, absolutely. Specifically, no ambiguity.
Okay, so we know what it is now. Is that the same thing then as a disclosure order? Because sometimes in court, or you hear solicitors maybe talking about disclosure orders. Is it the same thing?
It's practically the same thing. Disclosure, if we looked into it, disclosure could be a bit more elaborate and broad, but the Gary Doyle Order is a catch-all for disclosure. Now, within disclosure, there are subheadings and more subheadings. To find, if you like, a bit more detail about what disclosure is, other than just a Gary Doyle Order. Gary Doyle Order is an order that the court gives for, it could be specific evidence or specific information, or it could be all of the information and evidence and data and so on and so forth to be disclosed. So, apart from looking for a Gary Doyle Order, which is a broad term that the court would use for disclosure, you should look into what constitutes disclosure itself, which is outlined, as you're aware, under the DPP Guidelines for Prosecutors 2010.
And it's always good to know what's in their armoury, so I mean,
Absolutely.
people should refer to that all the time.
Very good point, actually, Lionel. When you're looking at the Gary Doyle Order, apart from obviously you would, and I would hopefully recommend reading the book, The Gary Doyle Order, people can download right this moment from the internet under the DPP Guidelines, and under the DPP Guidelines for Prosecutors year, I think it was 2010. So, as you suggested, putting in your armoury, it tells you exactly what the prosecutor can do, how they go about their business, and so on and so forth. So, the main sections we would be concerned about is sections 8 and 9, which talk about disclosure and what primarily the prosecutors can do in court. Now, the other sections may be worth reading as well to find out all the stuff about how they operate in the background. But certainly, sections 8 and 9 of the DPP Guidelines, if you're going into court or you perceive you might end up in court for an alleged criminal offence, it's mandatory reading as far as I'm concerned. It's something you should not avoid doing. You should read it inside out, upside down, because it'll tell you everything that the prosecution can or cannot do.
Yeah, and what a great frame of reference to have then when you're working on your defence. So
It's
I
a bit
don't
like,
really.
a bit like Sun Tzu, Know Your Enemy.
Again, The Art of War is a book that I think is mandatory reading for everybody. Children should read it as they're growing up. It's very very powerful information.
I've got the CD of it. It's actually better when you listen to it a few times. Maybe we could do The Art of War here as a session as well at some stage, yeah?
I think that's a very good idea. I'll make a note of it. So if there's anybody out there who isn't familiar with Sun Tzu's The Art of War and would like us to do a CLS Talks on that, a CLS Talks episode on that, I'd certainly be well up for it. So we'll see if there's any demand for it. And of course, we welcome feedback on the show as well, because without your feedback, it can be a little bit tricky to know exactly what's resonating with people in terms of the information they want to hear. So it's always welcome.
Well, look, I'm not being flippant when we mentioned The Art of War there, because I think it is actually a good way to, or a good use of an analogy to look at the court system in terms of the art of war. Because when people we're speaking to come to us, we try to let them know that by getting into what they're getting into, it is a war. Yeah. And within that war, you'll have several battles. Some of the battles you will win, some of them you won't win. So if you look at it in the broader context, it is a war. If you're familiar with the art of war, as Sun Tzu has called it, then you'll realise that you won't win all of the time. Okay, but there is a perception that, or you could create the perception that even if you have lost, you still have won. A Pyrrhic victory or a moral victory. So, as we suggest to people, and I think we've discussed this before anyway, Lionel, you never lose until the day you give up. So if you're prepared to put in the battles, you will eventually win the war. The only time you will lose that war is when you walk away from it and give up.
Powerful advice indeed. As you said, it's not flippant, it's something that can be taken on board, and when applied to the war or the overall case, you realise that you're actually the one with the power. And we've spoken a lot about power and perception of power and taking back power and ceding power, which most of us do on an almost daily basis, which is why a lot of us find ourselves in the positions that we do. That really is the key to it. It's about power, and it's about not ceding that power to others. And the Gary Doyle Order, then, to bring it back to that topic, really is about empowering yourself with information. So I don't see, from the way you've described it, a downside to, if you're in court, going in and requesting a Gary Doyle order as a matter of course. Is there any perceivable downside to it? Why should you not do it?
There is absolutely, unless somebody can show me, and nobody's ever shown me or proven to me that there is a downside to seeking a Gary Doyle order, i.e. disclosure from the court. The analogy I'd always give, it's not just for the Gary Doyle order, but in terms of disclosure itself, is that it's like you're at a table and you're playing somebody in poker. And the Gary Doyle order, when you seek a Gary Doyle order, what you're saying is to the other opponent is, I know that I'm allowed to see your hand. The law tells me I can see your hand, but you can't see mine. So you get to see their hand. And 99 times out of 100, it'll prove that they actually are bluffing. When you look at their hand and analyse what's in their hand, they have a dead hand. It isn't worth the paper it's written on. Now, once they show you your hand, once they show you their hand, they can't change cards.
Right, that's very, very important. Once you've got the disclosure and you've got the information, it's set in stone. They can't change it, they can't add to it, they can't take from it. That's it.
At that point in time, correct.
Okay, so you know exactly then, once you get your Gary Doyle order, you know exactly where you stand with regard to what weaponry or armoury they can come at you with.
Correct, absolutely.
And it's at that point then, if we were using that analogy of a battle or a war, that you have a bit of time to actually assemble your armoury. So you can figure out, well, what's going to counter what they've got and add to it and hopefully blow them away.
Yeah, you can assemble your army relative to what they have or have not got.
That is power.
Yeah, that's absolute power. That's why we couldn't go on and you couldn't go on and I couldn't go on enough about this. Every day of the week, like for things that are minor and major in terms of criminality. But again, like we will ultimately get into the material that's contained in the book, but this is sort of a more broad spectrum for people. Yeah, is that when you go to court and you seek the Gary Doyle order, they have to disclose what they have. Okay, so that means, as you suggested yourself, that you get to see what they have, and then you can prepare your artillery or weaponry against what they have. Now, again, as I said, it's worth saying again, in 99% of cases, they do not have the artillery. They will give you the perception. It's all bluff.
Why is that, Des?
Well, it's a combination of ignorance of the law and it's a scam. There's two things I think are to blame for that. There's a massive scam. Now, when there's a scam, when you're, not that I'd know this, but if you're committing a scam, I'd imagine that you're going to sort of muffle everything. You're going to make everything blurry because you don't want people to see through the scam. Okay, so that's why you have these. The court is there. This is the judge is there in the hat and the gown. You have the barrister. You have the DPP. Blah blah blah. They have a whole, if you like, room full of. It's like a stage set up for you. So they're putting on a bit of a play. Okay. Now, if you get to see what's behind the play, you realise it is only a play. It's only a scam, because that's all a play is. If you look at it from reality, you know that you're being scammed. Okay. Now, most people think when they go into a court that they're not being scammed. They think it's real. That's how convincing these actors are.
Maybe that's why they call legislative pieces of paper acts.
That's exactly, I'd imagine, why it's called that.
Yeah.
Well, that's why they call solicitors, isn't it?
It's all in the language.
Yeah,
it's very, very interesting.
But it is just a play. I mean, once you see behind the facade, that was the word I was trying to get, the facade of what they have up there, and you see the evidence. I mean, the last case specifically that we were involved with was a revenue case. We won't get into the nuances and the finer detail, but on the face of it, the man was very worried because he could have potentially spent 4 or 5 years in prison.
Serious.
A very serious case, and I think the fine with all the different charges combined would have been between 25 and 30,000 euros.
Okay.
So very, very serious. It would have destroyed his life. So I said, look, the best thing we can do is you seek the disclosure, i.e. the Gary Doyle Order, and then we'll assess what they have. And without giving away the full detail of what happened, he came back, and he came back with 5 bits of papers. Certificates, 5 certificates from revenue.
Right.
And honest to God, they weren't evidence. They were evidence of nothing.
So were these like registration certificates or something along those lines?
No, they were internally generated certificates to certify that this man had not made a declaration.
So they were their own bits of paper?
Internally generated certificates.
Right.
It'd be like if I said to you, Lionel, I want you to give me a certificate to say I'm a brilliant DJ.
Yeah, it's proof of nothing.
But you could give it to me, couldn't you?
Of course I could.
Yeah.
But it's proof of nothing.
It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean say I am or am not a brilliant DJ, but it actually doesn't prove anything. It's not proof. So that's what revenue came back with. Now, we had fun with it. It did take a while because they put on the facade, they put on the play, the judge was there in her gowns, and the solicitor was there, the state solicitor and the DPP, the whole facade.
Yeah.
All the actors were in place. So we had to sort of beat the actors one by one. And one of those actors included the judge. We had to actually get to the judge, pin the judge down, hold the judge, stop the judge from sliding around the desk.
Yeah.
Pin the judge down. And eventually when we pinned the judge down, ultimately they struck the case out. Okay. Now that's a pretty serious thing to have struck out, given that it was a criminal charge. It could have been 4 to 5 years in prison. Certainly would have been 25, 30 grand worth of a fine. So that's a pretty serious charge to get struck out. Now, it did take us 4 goes in the court to do it, but we did it through the paperwork, and that's because we had full disclosure.
So that's how vital it actually is.
I couldn't stress how vital it is to know what they know. As I said, it's me and you playing a game of poker, and I get to see your hand, and you at this stage do not get to change your hand.
Well, you couldn't have won that case, I would imagine, certainly not in the way that you did, without the Gary Doyle Order.
Absolutely not, no.
Well, that's how important it is, and there is a book, and you've mentioned it a number of times. We've mentioned it many times on the CLS Talks, and the object of this series will be to go through the book, which is, in essence, a case study. It's there's specificity again, but with a degree of specificity, it examines one man and his battle in the court and his application of the Gary Doyle Order within that battle and the overall war, and how ultimately that helped him to get the outcome that he got. We're going to be going into it in some detail and explaining every step of the way why what was done, and I do think it would be a big help for a lot of people if they had the book in front of them when they're listening to this, so that they can actually reference specifically what we are talking about. And the book is available from the Common Law Society with the links below, so you can check that out. With regard to the story, we'll give a little bit of background to the story. We won't get into the details. We'll talk about, I suppose, the side of the road before we get into episode 2, just to whet the appetites a little bit, and it'll save us then quite a bit of time and beating around the bush in episode 2.
Well, do you want to give a summary, or you give the summary and I'll jump in?
By all means.
Yeah.
We have one man minding his own business driving down the road.
We'll call him Tom.
We'll call him Tom. So
Because that's what the guard calls him.
Okay. So Tom is driving down the road minding his own business. He gets stopped by the guard. He's unclear as to why exactly he has been stopped by the guard, but the guard is
But
not...
he has been stopped.
He has been stopped. And the guard is not happy that he asks a couple of questions with regard to why exactly
He was
has
stopped.
been stopped. So he then tries to figure out, by asking a few questions of the guard, is he under arrest, is he free to go, and establishes that he's not under arrest. So he informs the guard that he will be on his way, that he needs to go home, and that he has his own private business to
Or
attend to.
words to that effect.
Exactly. So off he goes. Problem perceivably forgotten about until the flashy lights go on behind him again and he's pulled over, and there's a great degree of aggression on the part of the Gardaí, who ultimately arrest him. And now I stress the aggression is on the part of the Gardaí, not Tom. He's arrested and he's brought off to a Garda station and he's questioned, and he really doesn't know what's going on, and he's betwixt and between, and he's stressed out of his mind, and that essentially sets the tone for the Gary Doyle Order.
There's no drugs. There's no drugs involved, and there's no weapons, and there's no guns or nothing unlawful like that.
No, there's no crime involved. There's no perceivable crime
No murder,
involved.
no rape, no anything.
Nothing like that.
But it is still a criminal case. Just keeping that in mind. Yeah.
Yes, it's a criminal case, but no perceivable crime has been committed by Tom at this point.
Yeah.
So he ultimately winds up in court,
Yeah.
and that's where we're going to leave it for today on the first episode of the Gary Doyle Order on the CLS Talks. And we have some meaty stuff to get into in subsequent episodes. So hopefully people will have garnered from that where we're going with it and why we're going in that direction with it. As I said, if they want to get their hands on the book, you can do so. It'll certainly help you along the way. As well as that, if anybody has any questions, stick them in the comments box underneath on YouTube, because we will endeavour to address those in the second episode as well.
And we will go off on tangents where appropriate as well.
Absolutely. If there are any two men who are going to go off on tangents, it's us. So bear with us and don't be frustrated. There generally is method in our madness.
Absolutely. That's grand.
So thanks for bearing with us on this episode. We will be back very soon with episode 2 of the Gary Doyle Order as the CLS Talks continues. Thanks for joining me, Des.
You're welcome. Thanks very much, Lionel.
Looking forward to the next time.
The CLS Talks.